So this is a really easy one to start off with, because I'm thinking of this in a really like a broad way, because you're obviously coming at all of these different sort of aspects of creativity, from neuroscience and from production and from being a guitarist and from being a computer scientist, all kind of rolled into the one,
One
slash
amorphous
research,
mass, yeah.
amorphous mass. Yeah. So how would you explain hypercreative processes to someone, especially from your workflow?
Wow, that's a question, isn't it? So in a way, you're looking at a multimodal approach. And I think that's, when I was looking at, even when I was working on a paper on multiomics and proteomics, looking for protein markers, etc., is that all these factors you talked about there, just there in terms of neuroscience, computer science, musician, a guitarist, producer, etc., sound designer, is that when you're approaching any creative process, you may draw from any one of these fields as a starting point, and then you start lashing things around it, and then looking at that in that shape of the thing you've created, maybe the sound, or whether it's actually a few chords initially, or whatever it would be. It can be in terms of music as a kind of source. You may then start using other critical processes in saying, or critical and then subconscious processing as well, in terms of, does this feel right? Is this kind of the right kind of shape? Because also, when you've been working on a number of things for decades, it becomes an intrinsic part of your working process. So you're not necessarily thinking in a conscious sense. It's more kind of a muscle response sometimes in terms of what feels right. So that initial shape you produce could then morph into something totally different. You could throw that away and think, no, this is not working. It's too generic. And so you overlaying different processing from different disciplines to create this piece of music or work or whatever you're looking at. It could be a cinematic piece, it could be a pop song, it could be a classical piece, whatever you're doing from that point. And then there's a point where you should always leave it and then come back later, critically analyze that later to see whether or not it still stands up. So I always think, for me, in terms of all these processes, of course you can add in more processes if you want to, more as you're learning new skills, etc. You can bring those into the mix as well. But generally, it's a multimodal approach, drawing in from to see if the initial shape is fine, just as a starting point. Sometimes you might be really lucky and think, wow, that's fantastic. Well, it's fantastic hook. I can do something with this. Other times you might get some kind of way you might put your hands on the keyboard and go and get this smoky chord and think, there's something there, I don't know what it is, but it could actually then inspire you to do something totally different. And so as a final thought to that, I'm always into the oblique strategies, the Eno cards, in terms of do something different, destroy everything you've just done as well. So there's chaotic element in there, and they're saying, well, will this stand up? Would I like this tomorrow? Or just record everything and then just mash it together. So it's a constant kind of melding of ideas. That's basically what it is. So for me, that focusing on hypercreativity in that respect is that you can't do this over a prolonged period, as we've talked about. It's actually got to be done in the moment. And if it's not there in one or two takes, then just walk away from it, because you know you're not going to get anything good that day. You might get something good later, or maybe 3 days' time. So you're waiting for lightning to strike.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting one, because also I think the tools, as you sort of alluded to a little bit there, are very influential on what can and can't happen, especially when you're not playing around with analog tools that don't necessarily respond in the same way every time that you use them. Obviously, you pick a guitar up on day one and it can sound completely different on day two, or it might not stay in tune. And it's like atmospheric conditions and the temperature in the room can affect how all of these things work. So it's really interesting. And also in terms of the crossovers between, as you're saying, they're kind of different, not genres, but different disciplines, how that can also affect what you're doing and how you think about something.
Well, even with the neuroscience, with the guitar tunings, I was just tuning my guitar last night. It was in 440. I was playing some just standard stuff, and I thought, I'm going to tune it to 432, and I just felt better about it. So I made something really weird with it, and I think that also inspires me to do something else. Even playing with physics and just tuning frequencies can sometimes then affect my mood to then change that headspace. Again, psychology also plays a big part of this as well. So back in the day when I was first doing this, if I felt I wasn't kind of laying down 4 albums in a week, I was some kind of failure. And so it was a case of thinking, when what's good enough? When is it good to stop? And things aren't a failure. It's just a case of today the muse didn't strike, and not feeling bad about it. So it's that self-reflective process, critical analysis, also experimentation to say, I have enough faith in your skill set or lack of skill set, is that to know that when you're throwing things in the pot, that they're going to form something. And if it doesn't form, if it doesn't fizz enough, then you think, well, my ingredients today, or my ingredients could be the musical ingredients, the acoustic instruments, the electronics, or whatever it would be. The temperature, my environment wasn't conducive to create this alchemy. That's
Yeah,
it. And so,
totally.
so knowing that state when you're getting to a point where you're thinking, it's not you. It's not a failure to come up with, like, it's like Beethoven's Fifth, or whatever. It's that kind of thing. It's like I'm trying to think of I've got 4 symphonies. I use 5 symphonies. Why can't I come up with this last one? And so understanding the creative process in terms of that, it's a give and take thing where you got this subconscious thing going on, and sometimes you're just not in the mood to play. And then with the guitar, particularly, is that with me, it's all an all or nothing thing. If I'm into it, then I'll viscerally play it and thrash it about. Otherwise, if I'm not, it'll be a bit meh, and then basically nothing will kind of sound right. And I know there's no point in trying to pursue it. Everything, even playing favorite chord progressions, won't even sound any good because you think, well, it's not there. It's like back to Stevie Ray Vaughan again when he was kind of tuning up and loosening up. Is that when he got his tone, then he had the tip of his hat and he knew he was in that zone. That was it. And it's just his subconscious cues where you're in the zone, and you're trying to get into this flow state where you've got delta wave activity happening as well, but also this emotive theta wave activity, and so you're in the zone. So as a musician, you're trying to get in that zone space without forcing it. And that's the big thing with this stuff.
I mean, I remember, before I come back to the tuning, I remember when I was in the RNCM doing masters, I think, there was a big emphasis then on being able to kind of train your productivity with being able to just come up with ideas. And there was some really great advice that got thrown around there from some of the lecturers that basically the phrase that was used was ripe for the bin. Always presume that what you're doing is bad, just do it, because it's much easier to kind of sculpt something from something than it is from, staring at a blank page, as it would be.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Then also slightly different thing from playing than sort of pure composition in an abstract sense, because you're sitting there, writing, or on a computer. It's not the same picking up an instrument and doing something. So you're talking there a bit about how the pitch change between 440 and 432 hertz, which corresponds roughly to about a semitone or so, doesn't it? So It's funny because the Stevie Ray Vaughan tuning, of course, is E flat. Hendrix was in E flat. I flat because I like it. It's great.
The chunky strings. Yeah.
Well, the big strings, if I put them in E, it's probably not good for the neck. But yeah. So what about the other elements? What about rhythm? What about emotion? How do all of those kind of aspects connect up in a similar sort of way to the pitch?
Yeah, again with rhythm, and again space is finding the right spaces to get the emotion kicking. So again, you could play, in the past I played speed metal and I play, you're just filling the space up. But ultimately it feels very flat because you're doing clever geometric shapes basically on the guitar in sound. So with tunings, especially when you think about 432 hertz, or you're thinking tune it into C, for example, that's that silky kind of C tuning, is that then that changes your playing in the sense of where's the space now? Can I just let the chords hang? Can I let this do? Also, the instrument as well in terms of decay time. And you think about when you're adding reverb or this kind of thing as well. Even interesting enough, when I play guitar, a lot of time it's unplugged because I like to see how far the notes can go in an unplugged setting with drones and open strings and stuff like this as well. I always experiment with that. But it's more a kind of how they tuning or the instrument. So if you tune into Dadgad, for example, you're playing slide, then it forces you to play in a totally different way, or drop D, for example. Or sometimes what I do to the hell of it is just basically just detune randomly into something, so you don't even know any finger shapes anymore. So you actually it's good ear training, because you have to force yourself to think, well, where's this note now? And when you try and do that, improvising over a track, that's what I used to do a lot of, and just basically detune some random strings and then say, crack on, can you still do a solo over this kind of chord progression? So it's situational in terms of, because obviously music is very ephemeral. You're creating something in them, unless you're recording it, and then it's forever. That's why it becomes that kind of polarity in recording and just being a musician, is that recording you're too hypercritical, so therefore you're riding the bike and worrying about falling off, so you do fall off, more likely to fall off. So this kind of strange dichotomy in terms of trying to play as if no one is watching, or you sat in your slippers on the stage. But I think the tuning itself can get you in a certain mood to then play something different to what you would normally play. And also, I've also found that if I'm playing too much in a style, I put the guitar down for 2 weeks, I don't even touch it, and I come back and then play again. And so when I went from playing speed metal to almost like Britpop in a way, or Blur type stuff, I left it for ages until I picked it up and I thought, naively, you pick it up and say, what I'm doing now? Or when you're playing Van Halen type stuff or Rush type things or whatever it would be, is that putting yourself in someone else's mindset and then coming back to your playing style, so you don't try and be an exact copy of somebody. You say, what's the element? So I'm back to my old thing of a mixtape where you take 20 licks from Hendrix, 20 licks from Alex Lifeson, 26 on Brian May, 26 on Van Halen, or whatever it be, or Stevie Ray Vaughan, and just get the essence. So BB King, that's how I incorporated vibrato from BB King instead of playing, because I just listened to 20 licks of BB King doing his vibrato. I think, oh, that's the essence I need to pull out. Then you can make some kind of soup in terms of it sounds more like you, because it's such a mix of, it's such a gumbo of stuff. So when I think back to your original question with the sense of the influence of the medium, whether it's an acoustic instrument or whether it's a synthesized instrument, or whether my favorite synth is Omnisphere. So when I can listen to one sound and I think, well, actually, it's doing something really weird here. How can I modulate that to kind of do something even weirder? It's like with one of my tracks, Sin City, with it used a Tesla arc sample as a basis, and then the arpeggiation I put into it was actually quite asynchronous. But while I was playing the track, it wasn't a case of just like looping that arpeggio. It was actually playing the arpeggio, just triggering the arpeggio all the way through the track. So my timing knocked it out slightly to make it more human. So those kind of things, it's been influenced by the quirks and the glitches in the hardware. And even with, say, Arturio stuff in terms of looking at vintage synths, it's got all the old quirks, remember, from the actual hardware. So again, you're playing with the bit that makes it go splurge off kind of thing. So I'm more interested in using equipment or even code, even in terms of that, to create some kind of weird thing. And I think, oh, what's that? And then that can influence you as well into doing something else.
So basically what you're saying is that you sort of think that the technology itself can kind of shift the meaning of how we create and how we experience as well. Because I was thinking before about what you were saying with the 432 stuff, that in terms of actually synthesizers, when you have two oscillators with one slightly detuned, because if you have this 432 and then you've got something that's sort of 431 point whatever, so it's like got close beating, that would be, because also I think that perception is really tied to lots and lots of cultural factors as well as the literal sense. And in the kind of neuroscience of this, how closely tied do you think we are to the kind of culture versus let's say the real physical parameters? So say if I took a tuning, if I took equal temperament and I play a scale on a piano to someone that's sort of from the Western hemisphere, they're going to sort of go, oh yeah, that's a C major scale or whatever. But then if we take that and we apply some kind of tuning to it that's not equal temperament anymore, and we sort of squish those intervals so it becomes something else, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong. It's just not what the culture says is normal.
I think it's quite interesting question from a neurological sense, we really are hardwired to music. And there's one paper, fMRI, functional MRI paper by this Alluri group in, I think, 2012 or 2014. I can't remember the exact date, but they looking at brain functionality when the brain was presented. And the person was presented music. So there's very small areas of the brain associated with melody, timbre, rhythm, plexity, tone, all this kind of stuff. But basically, it's really small parts of the brain. It's ramifies throughout the entire brain as well. So there's lots of little lights that light up. It's not just kind of your auditory processing centers glued onto either side of your head like Mickey Mouse. It's actually hardwired throughout the entire brain. So when we listen to music, it's a multi-brain functionality, is multi-brain processing. So we have a sense of where it's not just like your ears hear it and then it processes it and then that's the sound. It's the higher brain function in terms of you're looking at even things that are looking at processing in the moment or nostalgia. So all these overlays of things happen just from the pure physical concept of transferring a sound frequency into something which our brain processes as sound. So that's a big question in terms of a big thing in terms of, it's always that thing of if a tree falls down in a forest and nobody's there, does it make a sound? Essentially, it has to have a living thing to analyze that sound. The way a cicada may analyze sound is maybe totally different to how we analyze sound. Obviously with frequencies, but we can look at that sound as an abstract. So we're processing this thing as an abstract, but as sound, it means something to a human brain. Now, so that hardwiring has been millions of years. And of course, it's a pity we can't look at early hominids and say how much brain was associated with music or processing or making a sound or vocalizing. Obviously, we had appreciation of sound before vocalizing in that respect. So you've got all these millions of years of history across the species of Homo sapiens. So we're all the same, apart from when you maybe say, well, what did the Neanderthals how do they process things? But we're all humans, so there may be at one point there were about 10 different human species on the planet, and then there's only one human species. It's an entirely different question. But so we've got this innate hardwiring for sound, audio, the meaning of audio, and what this means as well. Some purely survivalist mode where you had a saber-toothed tiger, you had the trumpeting of an elephant, you had whatever it would be. You recognize environmental sounds, so they became hardwired. Our brainstem, for example, it can recognize up to 20 naturalistic sounds. It's part of the fight or flight response, but it's still hardwired to sound to react in 10 milliseconds. Our ears process sound within 50 milliseconds. So there's that kind of panic thing where you go leap out of the way of a falling kind of mammoth or whatever. Or there's appreciation in terms of a sound and where's that sound coming from? What is that sound? How is that sound being produced, etc. So all these things are being processed really quickly. Over millions of years, you can appreciate that we go from naturalistic sounds to sounds we produce. And that could be a communication type thing. But then obviously with the sense of rhythm came in there. And that's another big thing in terms of the rhythmic, aspect of human communication and how it's developed in music. So that whole kind of developing over millions of years is hardwired in us. So we're looking at, say, different music types, say, for example, Indian ragas. And so there's work trying to get together for this one, for another research grant, looking at the effect of different ragas on your biorhythms during the day. So there's been some work being done on this before, where there's different ragas, different notes, kind of clusters, etc., or different rhythms, etc., which actually are only played at the beginning of the day, middle of the day, or end of the day. And so over thousands of years, this has been just empirically put together. So even though raga obviously is obviously to Western ears, it's complex, etc. The rhythms are produced, also the tunings is 432 hertz as well, with that cosmic om sound, etc., etc. But it's interesting with the rhythms themselves and the notes then produce the interesting mix of subharmonics. So the interesting mix of subharmonics actually go hand in hand with our hardwired brain musicality. So to answer your question in that respect, in terms of genre, so that genre can develop locally and develops into a type of music, whatever type of music would be, which becomes socially acceptable as a social construct in a way. But ultimately, the music, the rhythms, the frequencies are all universal. This is why music, you can listen to any kind of music. I mean, as humans, we know it's music because it's music, but it can strike a chord with us basically either socially. So if you're into, hard rock or whatever, you may be into, those frequencies or that drop D tuning or E flat tuning, etc., because you like the way it feels when you listen to it live. But it might be too loud for someone who's more kind of pop sensible, or kind of more like classical music, or like Japanese Kyoto music or whatever it would be. But the frequencies themselves, it's almost like the social construct, but also how does it make me feel? And in some ways, when you look at those well-being apps, and it's got like I've got 432 hertz frequency. In a way, that's very much snake oil in a way, because it's not just that one frequency; it's the harmonics and the subharmonics, and also the temporal interaction, or basically the interaction over time in terms of how those particular mix of frequencies form a particular signature, and that's what fires us up, basically.
To be honest, that's what kind of bothers me about the 432 argument in general, is that I think it's taken in a way that's too simplistic, because if you're talking about sine tones, pure tones where there's no harmonic information at all, it's just the tone, then maybe there is a difference in some way. But then, because I think what's really interesting about it is if you take 432 and say, but we could make it 431, is that not going to give the same effect? This sort of slackening off of half the,
in some ways, but then with certain frequencies, you're looking at resonant frequencies. So you're talking about that thing of whether that frequency itself. So, for example, 60 gigahertz is the resonant frequency of oxygen. So that frequency will deform oxygen. So the electron flow won't sit quite right. So it can't dock with adenosine diphosphate to make adenosine triphosphate to create stored energy in the mitochondria, for example. A precise frequency will affect certain organs. Say if you're setting a big bass speaker, so you expect maybe 5 hertz might affect your spleen in a different way to your liver, but that's obviously not great, because it just means that energy is vibrating with your body cells to disrupt them. Like, it's a sonic disruptor. And so one frequency itself isn't enough, isn't conducive to feeling good about anything. It's not when you think about just crazy stuff with binaural beats, or even using apps to generate alpha waves, whatever, basically 8 to 13 hertz. For one reason, for several reasons, that if you get your earpods, they aren't going to kind of basically accurately model 8 to 13 hertz. And also, if you're talking about modulating 8 to 13 hertz in, say, your frontal lobe or occipital lobe in terms of visual cortex and those kind of stuff here, is that it's not going to work anyway, because it's just localized this one area. You can't put enough energy in to zap it to the side of your head, and if you did that, you'd probably blow a hole in your head anyway, because obviously that's bonkers. A lot of that other thing is almost that placebo effect, where people believe that, oh wow man, I'm adjusting my delta wave flow, this kind of flow state. I've got my 3 to 5 hertz now. I'm manipulating this using these earbuds, which can't produce that sound anyway, and I'm manipulating my flow state into my frontal lobes, to my higher brain function. I'm going to be this delta state, and you can immediately see, even biomechanically, even geophysically, it's impossible, So it is snake oil in that respect.
It's funny because it reminds me a lot of the silent disco kind of idea, which it takes away all of the physicality of being in a loud place with loud music playing, because it's just this. So it sort of makes sense in a way.
Because also with that, with the sound that you pick up through your body surface. So, for example, infrasound. For example, you get like those low subharmonics in the gig or whatever. Ultrasound also affects us as well, even though we can't physically hear it because it's above 20 kilohertz. We can still process it because it comes into our body surface and it's being mishmashed over our normal processing. So it gives us this sense of, through my work, that can induce synesthesia. And the thing is, somebody stood behind you, or something else is happening, or you can hear a high-pitched tone that's not really there. So frequencies themselves can actually modulate your perception of that sound. Like gamelan, for example, gamelan music, even though you have maybe 4 musicians or 20 musicians, whatever, playing what seems to be a similar volume, you keep getting spikes 100 kilohertz. So basically you get these really high frequency spikes, which are being perceived, which are being presented to the body and basically absorbed by soft tissue, bone conduction into the central nervous system to modulate the kind of the musical response as well. And this is the argument when people say about, having high definition, high sampling audio, is that someone making it better by having these other frequencies in there. So sometimes if you know that it's affecting in some ways, then it's obviously hitting your particular way of processing audio. Because obviously, as humans, it's not like we have brains just like Lego bricks, where you have a little red block in there, and they've all got in the same place, all this kind of, so we all perceive everything the same way. I mean, look and think about color perception. My color perception of red may not be the same as your color perception of red, but we kind of we're in a certain range. Same thing with music. And so, as you know, with mixing, you can do a mix one day and listen to the same mix the next day and think this is appalling. You're thinking, wow, this is really bad, and you start hearing other bits in the mix which don't seem to work, and you go back to the next day and then it's all normal again. So it's your brain can quickly pick out a kind of a part of a song or part of a sound and fixate on that as well. So this fixation magnifying kind of zoom function, if you will, on audio. So in a sense is that all these things can really influence in how you perceive sound. So in fact, what's been done so far, so with the binaural beats type stuff and the influencing my brain waves and the single frequency stuff, is really reductive because it's more complicated than that. And also because trying to explain how music works from a brain level is sadly really reductive even then,
Well, yeah, I think also, it depends on how you look at it, of course. But what I'm actually kind of interested in with the neuroscience perspective on this is when we think about AI and how that's now becoming quite a big part of music production. How do you perceive AI as being able to or potentially able to cause manipulation of feeling or emotion or, being able to kind of control people in some way through this, through this possibility of
Well,
creation?
yeah, because with that, I mean, basically, if you've got working with an AI and the AI is saying to mix this way or have this is the idea I have here of a kind of country song, whatever, generic country song, then you're not driving the car anymore. And I think in a way you can liken it to brain exercise. If you're not thinking, you're not using your brain, then it deteriorates. So basically, as we know, if as a child you get no stimulation, then you don't produce any you just have basically a smooth brain in a sense, because there's no reason to have convolutions because you're not actually absorbing anything or growing in that respect. And over time, it's like if you retired, did nothing for 20 years, then you're not going to be sharp because even without the concept of AI, you're not going to be sharp because you're not challenging yourself every day with something or a project or something which is making you think about stuff. So the brain, the neuroplasticity of the brain itself is basically truncated. So you're not actually, you're not using your brain. So the more you stimulate your brain, then the more you're going to, possibly more ideas you're going to have, or more creative potentially you're going to be in this respect, depending on your skill level and everything else. So in terms of where AI is at the minute, as I see with students, etc., is that they use that as a crutch to kind of just say, oh, write me an essay, write me this. Can you give me some, as you can see with AI tools, a large language models, that you say you can give me a chord structure like in terms of like Steve Morse, for example. Give me a solo in the style of this, or do me some tab. And all it's doing is actually just doing whatever is on trained data, which is out there, which might not be correct anyway. And also, you're not talking to Steve Morse himself about how he plays guitar. What his tower of playing guitar is always approach. So you've got an understanding of any back to our original question about creativity and this multimodal approach about trying different things out. The AI itself will only be giving you a developer's view of what creativity is. It's not what creativity is in that respect. So it just makes you lazy. Going back to Arnold Schwarzenegger in terms of you're not pumping out, you're not working out, you're not doing the thing, you haven't incorporated that into your lifestyle, you're never going to get any better at it, because the AI itself is going to give you, oh, this is a country song, this is my version of a metal song. Oh, that's great. But it's like everything's flat. It'll never go anywhere. There's no thing of saying, well, what happens if I just switch my Marshall onto 11 at this point? And how does that change the sound? And how does that change my way of approaching this solo or this piece of music? So the AI tools at the moment are being misused in that respect as a kind of way to supercharge yourself and give yourself a super skill. But it's all generic. So if you're a beginner and you're writing a song, you say, wow, I've got a song, it's like this. But there's a point as you're a songwriter, that tool plateau out, and they'll plateau out quite early on. So your creativity could be up here, but that tool will plateau out because it's just trained to be generic and homogenized.
How do you think about the kind of responsibility? Who has the responsibility to deliver the kind of next steps of that creativity? Is it the developer? Is it the AI itself? Is it the person using it? Is it someone, like yourself or me? Where is that line?
I think the initial line is with the artist or the person, whatever it would be, whether it's whether it's actually someone in science or researcher or an artist themselves, etc., musician, is that you say, well, this is not fit for purpose. It's like going to a washing machine and finding out your white Adidas top actually it comes out with coffee stains all over it. That's not good enough. So when the AI would say, look, it's perfectly clean, it would go this, but you say, well, it's not clean, it's still got coffee on there. And so this is the thing. It's this. It goes back to critical thinking as well, and also in terms of the individual to say, this is not exactly what I want. How can I make this better? And the thing is, it's not saying so much developer time, because obviously then the developer is just putting a model together to produce an output.
The developer is the blacksmith, kind of making the horseshoe in that way. I think what's kind of interesting then is that there's a bigger question around all of this, which is to do with education, because it comes back to this idea of training, at least in my opinion, the most important thing, which is critical skills, critical thinking. And, yes, having mechanical skills in certain areas of whatever it might be in STEM or in art subjects or physical, sort of training, whatever. But if you're not critically able to analyze and make decisions for yourself from some kind of baseline, how do you feel about that? Do you think the education system has failed people? Because looking at the evidence of what's happened, AI has become a thing, let's say a public kind of, it's in public. It's kind of 2023, realistically. And it's not necessarily been used in the best ways, as you've mentioned, students doing things with essays.
Yeah.
You've got, of course, this recent, news from Spotify clearing out however many million tracks of AI generated nothingness. But that's not to say the tools in themselves are actually the problem, because that's, like blaming the gun, isn't it? Rather than the person using because I think that, it's exceptionally dangerous to provide anyone with any skills or any tools when they are not critically able to analyze what they're doing.
Yeah. Because I think with AI tools, it caught people napping, basically. I think people were caught by surprise by the speed of it, because obviously it had a lot of investment. It had a had marketing off the scale, because you had lots of billions invested in it and billions to put into market, millions and billions to put into marketing. And it became sold as the next best thing. It's just basically snake oil in that respect. So people, I think now, 2 years in, they're looking at this isn't working, because, you're getting people who aren't learning anything. Basically, you could get an entire degree now by just using Chat GPT, and you come in knowing nothing about something and then still know nothing at the end of it. And when you go out in the real world, you know nothing. So what was the advantage of that? So personal responsibility at that point will kick in, regret after that point of saying, well, actually, I can't really grift off this because I've not learned anything. But I think, in a sense, tools themselves, I think it's just been a mass marketing campaign to push something which isn't that good. As an idea, it's interesting, because it's basically, to me, it's Google Plus instead of the Google Plus search, but you can't substitute by doing the work and the reflection on the work and this endless kind of trying to think around the work. So when you think about PhD work, so for example, my PhD and like yours were done pre all this. So you had to spend the hours, the frustration, the blood, sweat and tears to do the work, and the feeling that you've messed up, and all these kind of emotions, and the reflective thing, going for many long walks and coming back and trying to nail something from different angles until you finally hammered it down into this thing, which is the thesis, the book, to say this is what I did, and it makes sense to other people reading it. So that's missing in all this thing. You doing some work and actually not trying to bypass this sense of doing work as if it's something bad. Work. So if it took you if it took something you took you 2 hours in the AI can do in 2 minutes, you've learned a lot of things, other things in that 2 hours. And maybe other skills and other problem solving ways around that problem, which AI is just basically just scraping everyone's opinions about how I should boil an egg in that
Do you think
moment.
there's a vision, though, somewhere in there to say that there are parts of that process that could be automated, that are unnecessary to development, and then at the same time there are also processes in there that are very, very important to development, which are
Yeah,
usually the most
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
material things that you don't realize.
Yeah. Because I think the soft skills in terms of processing, etc., and the critical thinking is being left out of this process. Like, oh, never you mind, but the AI is going to take over and sort it all out for you, kind of thing. When I'm looking at my work with the audio watermarking, digital forensics, etc., the AI itself is only working from non-information, which is very limited from what it's going. Even got all the information in the world, working with sound is not the same as working with an image. It's more complicated than that. You're looking at transients. You're working with something which is which is really hyper complicated in terms of frequencies, frequency mixers, reverberation, you name it, etc., and artifacts, and all this kind of stuff. And so trying to get into the weeds of that with a few prompts is impossible, because the AI will give you plausible code, for example. It won't work. It looks great, but it doesn't do the thing, because it can't get the abstract thought processes. It can't mix some weird idea with aardvarks, a ladder, and and a glockenspiel to produce this new thing. It can't think like that. And even with coders, the developers, they've purposely taken these things out because they were too far-fetched. And with imagination, it never is far-fetched. It's imagination. So this has been boiled out of the AI itself.
There's something to be said for the shed. We've had this conversation a few times, I think,
Yeah.
about the idea of having the sort of the place that you can go and experiment with weird thoughts, as it were. That sounds awful, but
Yeah.
where you can go and say, okay, I'm going to take this thing and I'm going to smash it into this thing and see what happens.
Yeah.
And I think that there's an interesting kind of a question in there, which is about the sort of the accident as the creative process, or as part of the creative process, that
Yeah.
somehow isn't there anymore, which I think is not just AI, it's also in other forms of automation as well. And, if you think of, for example, if you're in a studio setup and you have to be able to plug in, various things into a mixing console, and then get that mixing console to send to an interface, which then has to send to a door, which you're then seeing. And there's lots of potential in all of those connections for things to not go in the right place.
Yeah.
Or you accidentally send a signal off to something that you didn't mean to, that then produces some thing, and you go, oh, okay, that's a really cool new idea.
Yeah. You'd never get that. You'd never get that with AI. And it's like when you think about Mark Knopfler's guitar sound for Money for Nothing, when he got that nasally kind of, guitar sound, is that was purely accident. They said, and they were just setting up, and they said, that's the sound, that's it, and don't move it. And you'd never get that again. It was never get that sound again on any guitar ever he's ever played. But that moment, he had that position of the amp on a certain level and angle at a certain point, the microphone somewhere, and it's just like everything, and the room itself, and that was it. And so all this sense of creativity is lost. An AI, to me, I want it to wash the dishes. I don't want it to create a guitar solo. I want to do that bit. The tools you can imagine after that, after this froth dies away, might be a case of, well, in certain situations we can try and get a better produced guitar sound quicker, maybe, but you still have the final say on what kind of gnarliness level you want, all this kind of stuff as well. And I think there's this thing at the moment, developers on one side, creatives on the other side, or the population on the other side, and the developers are saying, this is what we think Shakespeare is. We think Beethoven does this. We think a guitar should sound like this. This is what music should sound like. No, it's just that your interpretation as a developer is a non-creative.
it's a compression algorithm that they're applying to knowledge in a sort of very broad way to make it more sort of palatable for systems to be able to go through and sift and understand. And,
Yeah, yeah.
it's a big problem.
Mm.
But I think also there is a kind of an interesting part of that where, we could sort of look at it and say, what will happen if it's possible to kind of use these bigger data sets? And as we know, this is now becoming, a possibility as
Mm.
servers are getting much bigger and more powerful.
There's a flaw in that, in a bigger data set argument as well. You could have all the
Okay.
data in the world, it wouldn't make it any better.
But essentially, if you had an infinite set of data, let's say, where it could always be updated with the newest whatever, your data set is forever kind of growing. And then you can also have smart algorithms running around that know to add randomization processes and that know to use historical precedent for smacking random
Mm.
ideas, or not random,
Mm.
but like maybe sparsely connected ideas together. Do you think it would be possible to create some kind of a network that would act
Even
more humanistically?
even then, from chaos theory, and I did a lot of this when I was at Cambridge with
Yeah.
chaos maths, is that you've defined a system then which is going to be deterministic in some way. So whatever you define it as with your parameters is going to be deterministic in a certain way. So it will always be deterministic in a certain trajectory. Even though you might move it around a little bit, you'll still be going in that direction. So for me, going back to the edge, less is more, because
Right.
with less you can do more, because with limitations you create something new. When you've got too much, you've got too many ingredients for the soup, you just create the thing which is like, is it inedible? Is it kind of edible? Is it kind of bland? Is it not? But if you only got three elements, you got, cheese, pasta, and a whelk, then you might be more inventive to produce something might be something which has never been done before, because you're forced to use this in a more creative way.
That makes more sense.
Yeah.
But then, I wonder about what's happening with, the sort of, rather than the idealized version of where this could go, is where it sort of seems to be heading, at least,
Mm.
because of course we can only roughly predict how anything will develop. But it seems like a lot of these companies are going for the giant data set model and these super
Yeah.
powerful AI. And,
It,
of course,
it'll.
in the context of,
Mm.
even Universal and Sony and Warner and all of these big
Yeah.
record labels, they're now obviously jumping on the bandwagon.
All that will be homogenized. If you took the other angle of this, you had an individual person, Steve Ray Vaughan, and his thoughts on everything, basically, and how Steve Ray Vaughan, a model of Steve Ray Vaughan, how he produced a guitar, but also his life ethos and his morality, etc. Is that as a basis for a trajectory for Steve Ray Vaughan kind of stuff would be better, and it can mash it with some other things. But in a sense, going small and exploring that macrocosm, or kind of the mini world, is going to yield more more interesting stuff than trying to splash everything together and say we're going to because if you did like it's like a creativity curve, if we want to that point. At some point, by knowing everything about everything, a good Japanese music versus jazz versus heavy metal, like death metal or whatever, is that, and then I start adding other components in. Eventually, as you start polishing and polishing, and then the idea itself will just be so polished, it'd be so bland. Whereas sometimes just instead of plugging an amp in, just hitting the wrong thing, and you think, oh, what's that? But that's where we are with, I think, with AI. Doing more is not more, because you always end up plateauing out any piece of information as well. It's always because the premise there is that assuming that we know everything about everything, and we don't, basically.
There must be a limit on information in terms of, what's possible within the universe. There must be a limit that we can hit. And
Yeah.
I wonder, if I know it sounds a little bit far-fetched, but if we literally said, okay, imagine it's the year 10 million and we've discovered everything there is to know about everything. There's no more death. There's no more, disease. There's no more money. Everybody's accepting and happy, and we've colonized the entire universe and, probably done a bit of first contact and all this stuff. The thing is, what then?
But see, that's the point again. That argument then is actually saying this is our initial parameters. This is our deterministic response to these initial parameters. No matter it takes 10 million years, 10 billion years, is that it was still biased. There's still bias in there. So
but
I mean,
even
a
if
system, yeah.
if you think of it as a sample rate kind of a thing,
Mm.
where you could say we have created an infinitesimally small sample rate that's always able to become smaller with what technology it might be at that point. And then you could say that every single variation of everything that you will ever do has already been done, no matter how micro the changes are.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, it's kind
But
of
also with that would also kill if you knew everything had been done, and there's this thing of what's the point anymore? You've reached what's the point of event horizon? At that point, there's no point. Then there's eventually after that point, there's some other species comes in and just does this different things. You know, I think with these kind of things, in computational senses, ultimately, what you think is being creative, also built around a paradigm. That paradigm can be very narrow and depend on the bias in AI as well.
Yeah.
It reminded me of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy point when Arthur Dent, obviously the main protagonist, is going to be is being asked by the mice, who are the hyperdimensional beings, to want to take his brain to find out the answer to life, the universe, and everything. But basically, the answer is screwed up because 5 minutes before the end, the Earth has blown up, and also the fact that the Golgafrinchans could be crashed on planet Earth in Stone Age times and wrecked the whole thing anyway, meant that the question was totally, the answer, it wasn't going to be 42. The question had changed basically, and it wasn't going to be the same answer. And in a way, it's the AI at the moment, in terms of the data it's been trained on, hasn't been verified as being authentic or even non-biased. Even looking at the, say, Springer, for example, when you look at Springer as a kind of academic platform, is that there's lots of papers on that which have been retracted over time because they've been found to be incorrect or biased, or depending on who's paid for that research. So, but the thing is, some of those things were slipped into the training net as fact, and so when you think, has this model been scraping Reddit, you know, for God's sake? And so we look at those kind of things. So when you've got this model in terms of creating music or being creative or creating a piece of art or a film or etc., is that it has the training data is inherently biased. So therefore the answer, the output won't be consistent to the truth. I think this is where the kind of the truth versus conjecture bias in AI models has gone through the roof now. So I think because there's so much money being spent on it, on training models, the amount of resource to produce something which is now based on something incorrect, you think, well, what is the worth of that tool, you know? And the thing is, this all singing or dancing kind of aspect of AI, when you only need a very small model to do something very specific and learn over time from that model as well by putting the relevant information in, I think that's where we need to go with subsequent tools that are going to be used for music or creativity or lyric writing or book writing, whatever. It's got to be something very specific, but also something which is, you'd rather be informed from, you know, a kind of a classic novelist who they say, you know, think about H.G. Wells or Jules Verne or William Blake, whatever. You want to be by curating what you think would be the best kind of people to fill that model, to influence and inspire you to do something better.
But don't you think that there's still a possibility for bias within those, you know, those kind of data?
I think that's the thing. It's a responsibility of the developer to responsibly develop this. It's ethically developing something rather than saying, I need to make X $1 million by next Thursday. What's the easiest low-hanging fruit I can put in this model? And I think this is where, as humans, it's curating. It's like when you think about, you know, somebody who's spent their time working up to be a Michelin chef or whatever, you know, that kind of thing. They spent their entire life to their art to produce food and dishes which are very, very kind of, you know, which are there artistically and also nourishing, etc., everything, all the kind of stuff that goes into it. If somebody like that, because they might have certain biases, etc., in there, curating that data and say, well, this is probably the best version of that chef we're going to get, or we've got 10 chefs. These are the best 10 chefs we have at the moment. This is our current dogma. We'll produce something which is right around this as well. But I think there's also going to be checkpoints in saying 10 years time, do we have better chefs in that respect in terms of how does this new model relate to the old model? There should be I think that to and froing of producing this almost like a reinforcement process where you're actually trying to reduce bias in a model. And I think that's also, I think that as an art form, as a kind of creative form, but also a developer's task, is going to be trickier because you're saying, well, what is bias, and understanding what bias you can consciously put in a model, what is going to be subconscious bias, but also each model is going to be, you have to go back to and reiterate the model, retrain the model. But you don't want to retrain like a model which is the size of the universe or etc., because that's going to be too time consuming. Also, you think the resources and the time spent to retrain a massive model to do everything, the amount of potential bias in that model is going to be massive anyway. So whether
But
that's
don't you think that there's a necessity to have to put some bias in there so that it's not just pure information? Because then, you have these questions like, what if I want to, make a bomb, or how do I, hurt myself? What's the
So
best,
yeah, and then
you
again
know,
with this kind of thing,
drug
it's guardrails.
kill myself?
Yeah, exactly. And those kind of guardrails in terms of mental health, best mental health practice, and also in terms of ethics and morals. That's the guardrails in terms of, if you're having a model which actually is put out in the world, those guardrails should be in place. But in terms of creative, and it's almost like some of the models in creative. I mean, obviously talked to a number of people researching this area, who when I said, about creativity models, and they said, well, it's like if you had, we're talking about, creating a torch, and you could have ants carrying a torch through a forest and lighting up their graffiti, whatever they would do, or their car manufacturing network. And as they said, well, they're just crazy ideas. They said, well, define crazy versus creative. And that's the thing, is like, if you're limiting a creative model by saying you can't have this, this, and this, and this. So, for example, you could have, say, in the style of Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner, their kind of antics of blowing you to the rope, etc., or doing something, So it's that comedic element in terms of Roadrunner basically Wile E. Coyote runs out of road, and then either just falls. He defies gravity for a bit and falls. And if you're looking at that in the hard kind of conventional sense of don't jump off cliffs, kids, and this kind of thing, and it's not very sensible, you can't do this kind of thing, then we would probably ban all cartoons in that respect. The Simpsons wouldn't exist. Nothing would exist in that respect. But I think it's the delivery in terms of how you're putting the guardrails around what is regarded as comedy. And that's a fine line between what's regarded as being hateful. So I think with guardrails particularly, it's not directed at a person to say, this is a dangerous thing. For example, in the work I do with EEG, is that a person brings their own thing they want to explore, and they scan the brain and see what the brain is doing. It could be people don't think of all the different combinations of things which could trigger someone. And so again, with this kind of thing, so whether you go from, it depends, because if you're doing a compositional kind of thing where you might say in indie kind of guitar world or kind of industrial, where you might talk about self-harm and stuff like that as well. So there's those kind of things where it kind of goes off in some dark places. And when you think about those kind of things, is that, again, it's almost like the personal responsibility of the developer, plus the personal responsibility of the person using it. And maybe, I don't know whether you could actually have a tool which has said, well, actually, you're not in a good place to be using this tool. Maybe that's the thing. Maybe as a person, if you talk to another person that they were having mental health problems, you might say, well, actually, as kind of a mentor, you might say, use this instead. Give that a go, because that's the more intense type tool, which is going to maybe challenge you or maybe bring up dark stuff. Don't use that one.
Don't you believe that in itself is really problematic?
It
Because
is.
who would get the distinction of whether you're,
Exactly.
in the right space or not to be able to?
Exactly.
I think there's arguments to be had that could say that perhaps the act of being creative and talking about problems, talking about things that are maybe from a dark place, whatever, that maybe you need to be able to do that to somehow release it, to feel better, to vocalize your
totally.
problem.
I think
But
that's
just to say, on a low level, like, I already noticed that this is an issue with certain LLMs. When I'm trying to ask things, and nothing actually particularly strong, but sometimes, it will say, "Oh, well, you shouldn't do this in this way." I'm thinking, why are you telling me that you know, it's very odd, this
Yeah.
this kind of feeling of having somehow someone around, sort of pointing you in a direction that maybe you don't really want to go in, and
And
it feels kind of not
I
good.
think the technology as it stands isn't fit for purpose. For example, my argument with it last time, well, not last time, but asking for prompts whether what subharmonics of 432 hertz existed in terms of frequencies, and it said you can't have subharmonics, and I thought that really annoyed me. And I just felt like, this is I'm not going to have an argument with an algorithm, but this is wrong. But there's no kind of thing as well. Actually, this is wrong. Yes, stop the prompt. Even to say stop the prompt, you just like stop it immediately. There's no kind of mistake in that. It's just like it's created in a way to try and find a solution to something, regardless of what the person prompting it is actually saying at the time. So it becomes on equal levels infuriating, not very useful in some places. Or if you expect somebody, as I know academics, I talked to at the co-creative conference in Brazil, they were using it to talk about personal problems. Talk to Claude about my personal problems. And I'm thinking that, why would you do that? Why? Because the thing is, like, this algorithm is an algorithm. You could quite easily kick out an answer which you'd simply say, "That's it. I'm going to jump off the cliff," kind of thing now. So I think, and I know with talking about, as I mentioned about the Wiser app, mental health app in India, used to putting together, that was 4 years of development for putting suitable guardrails on to basically use as a mental health app in rural India to help people either get through the day or basically act as a mentor in terms of what to do next, etc., or kind of a listening ear. But there's a certain guardrails on where a human had to intervene at some point if it went too far south. And so all these things haven't, even with the best will in the world, there's always going to be that fallout where something bad happens with something, and then the whole platform gets taken down or whatever it would be. If you got a person in a certain frame of mind, is that whatever you're going to say is going to trigger something. But I think AI and large language models in general have been developed quickly. I mean, it's obviously accumulation of deep learning, machine learning, etc. The critical mass it achieved to produce this large language model, which is now being used as a central piece of all these different iterations of AI, is poorly is a poor kind of tool to use in everyday life, because again, people are now projecting their own problems onto it, etc. So it's like Depeche Mode, personal Jesus, isn't it? This is my personal Jesus. I can talk to this. It'll give me some insight. And it was interesting, even writing the paper today for the Lancet we're putting together, is that we put some prompts in, just give us some piece we'd already written by hand, and say, just summarize this into something. And he gave us his usual kind of marketing tagline and stuff like that. We copied bits of it, and in the end, we just used the bits we'd actually written, because the bits we actually wrote were sensible and actually covered all the points we want to make in that respect. So all the AI comments got deleted. Nothing got used at all.
But wouldn't you argue that the back and forth with the AI may have influenced what you were writing in the first place?
Well, and things by hand without an AI initially, which were very eloquent in terms of what we were going to put as a mission statement, also the Lancet paper itself. And we just said, summarize this in terms of an abstract. And it's missing out key parts. It was missing out all sorts of different things. And then when I put prompts back in, say, can you expand on this, or take this bit and put this and everything, it just got more and more, it just went off on this tangent. It just went down this thing, which is like, because obviously the thing we do is more kind of based around a multimodal analysis of EEG data, or actually mental health, etc., or what that moment is. But the abstract kind of form of this, the AI couldn't exist. And then so we're looking at three different AIs, and it couldn't actually put it together in that sense. For me, it feels like simplifying the tool is one thing, so you can do a certain thing, well, if you're helping with songwriting, for example, that's probably a wider kind of realm. If we're just looking for EQs and saying, pick out the dodgy kind of spikes on this and just identify the bad bits in the mix, for example, that's one thing. So that seems to be fair. That's fairly innocuous in relation. Writing lyrics is the thing where, the basis should be where you've got, as even writing lyrics, you've got free reign over that pen and pencil and writing on a pad. The AI should actually maybe, if it started to put into ideas based around lyric lines you're going to do next, is that at what point will it get too dark for that person? You can't preempt everything in the world in terms of it's going to affect that 1 in 100,000 person or 1 in 20 kind of people. So there's a fine line in terms of, for me, it's when the AI just stops working. So it's like an emergency brake, and that doesn't exist.
Do you believe, though, that this time that we're in now, this sort of little moment in history, is simply a door that has to be opened that we can walk through, be able to get to the next stage? Because, if you think of examples like the car and how, over more than 100 years, that's developed from being basically a carriage with a tiller, into vehicles that are capable of parking themselves that can go at 400 kilometers an hour quite confidently. Or another one is you look at the Wright brothers plane, or even the gliders that were before, and you compare that now with scramjet
Which is phenomenal.
technology
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
these jets that can do
yeah,
80,000
yeah,
feet.
yeah, yeah,
It's very,
yeah.
I agree that the AI as it is now is not in the place it
Mm,
could be. It's simply the moment where it's building. And I think there's a lot of things that can come of this. And I'm guessing that this is a little bit sort of, a moment of novelty as well, in that, of course, it's fun. You go and you generate
mm.
stuff and you can ask it questions and whatever, make me an image of a cat
Yeah,
doing
yeah, yeah,
this,
yeah,
this kind
exactly.
of, and it's cool that that's there at this stage. But I think that, we're sort of over the big kind of peak of that now. And I kind of feel like this is going to sort of trail into more sort of normal uses, and it will
Yeah, yeah.
become
I
better.
think for tools, that's fine. Like the EQ thing, for example, or doing something for, could actually do something which actually could analyze, scramjet optimization over a real time kind of thing. Those kind of things where it's actually optimizing stuff, it's making things work better in real time. I think those are things that are fantastic. But I think when we veer into the that bridge between algorithm and human psyche, because human psyche is, remember, that's like the 4K equivalent of what is in reality what that human brain experiences. In arguably 20K or whatever, you could be 20 to the power of nk or whatever it would be. But the moment, because AI is pooling data, it's reductive, it's just basically giving you kind of an approximation to something which could be really highly complicated. That reductive tool in that respect isn't matching what we are as humans. I think that's where the danger lies in any kind of creative tool to a certain extent. So if you can do a creative tool, it could be, say, looking at so one straight one I've seen was looking at dance maybe, and using the tool to glitch, so the person was then matching the glitch in a wireframe version of themselves, so they actually do new things, that's fairly innocuous in that sense. But I think once you get into the nuances of language, that's where it really gets dangerous. Either what I've seen so far in the tools for language are very generic. It seems to come out the same output each time in respect, even though you can create something more academic paper, in a more reference or paper sense. But even then, it plateaus very quickly. And I think even the tools we're talking about earlier about trying to recreate your own writing style, there's a certain point where that will to plateau. It will also plateau as well. But I think the nuances of the language don't really match up to what we have in our heads in general. I mean, to some people it may match up to basically, I either think this is a great way of getting something out which I don't need to think about. But when you read it back, it's really generic. And I think this is, so the 4K, almost like the Wizard of Oz Technicolor version of what we are compared to the black and white version of the AI tools, and also that disparity in terms of how its output can trigger us in many different ways, or maybe influence us in different ways. But ultimately, when we think about songwriting, is that it's very Moon in June kind of things, So for me, as a Dragon's Den, I'll be out of that conversation. I'm out of that. But I think for tools, which are actually looking at the heavy lifting for stuff, things like that are great because it can sift through and it can actually say, it's just having something identified, this is the weirdest thing I got in the database. That's really great. But asking you comments about history with the people associated with that, because it's not based in the in the real world in terms of way we perceive the real world, but obviously with our limited perception in terms of frequency projection, etc., and light, etc., and how we perceive sound, etc. But that in concept of how humans have evolved over millions of years into this really complex, entity, to even evolutionary say that this AI suddenly can match what we can do as is millions of years of evolution. I said the other thing you're talking about the other day about if we're 10 million years in time, etc., will we know everything, etc., and this kind of stuff. Maybe at that point we might have developed something which it could be, I don't know whether sentient is the right word, but something which actually would have some kind of deeper understanding of or there'd be nuance. But then trying to create that nuance from scratch it's going to be really difficult because you're dealing with software developers at the minute and their interpretation of what is a great book. How would you write this? And if I was marking them, if somebody's given their homework and I'm marking them, they get an E. That's it, or a fail. They get a triple F.
Do you think this is useful potentially most as a kind of force multiplier, being able to make the user do more things and to be able to speed up certain parts of workflows? Because, like anything, it doesn't matter whether you're sort of being creative or being not creative, but doing work stuff that, repeated kind of motion things and repetitive grinding tasks. But like, do you feel that somehow this has a use in certain parts of the creative process, even if it's not the whole thing?
I think it does. I mean, say particularly for grunt work, if you're trying to get something together, say for coding, for example, I just want to do kind of just create a dictionary in Python, populate it with some stuff as a start, and then maybe start looking for patterns for this kind of thing. So that starts you off immediately without having to sit there for ages. Even do it like even if you're coding a lot, is that you don't have to keep doing the same stuff. So that's why as coders you'd have code snippets you kind of take out from an archive anyway, because basically if I'm looking at fast frequency transformation, I've got certain code I'd always use for that transformation as a function. So I won't try and think, how do I do this from scratch? Because that would take me half a day to put together into sort of the right way I want to do it. Because there's obviously different ways to do that one function. Those kind of things are great. Or even just saying, the best color for this, for this presentation, or what were the best color for this, I'm putting together a suit or whatever, and what were the best color to match my skin tone, stuff like that. So things like that, which are kind of basically can be the start of a creative process, I think are great. I think maybe even when you say with song construction, you might say, well, give me a chord progression of Across the Universe, whatever you said by the Beatles, and say I want to then give me give me Foo Fighters Best of Me and stuff like that. So you think, well, I've got those two things, and any chords I can put together to play around with that to say, can I make some kind of amalgam or some kind of synthesis of those two tracks, and then think about using that as a start point to send me into something else. So maybe start a point where I throw everything and think, oh, I found this new chord. I think I never would have found it if I hadn't asked this question about giving me these chord sequences. So I think things like that are great for if you're talking about purely about song construction. I think even placeholder things where you're maybe even writing lyrics to start an extent, but then you wouldn't just say create me some lyrics for this and that's the final product. You might just throw them all away. And because it's like the thing with Robert Smith on The Cure, just suppose maybe he's writing songs, might just listen to 3 or 4 songs to get a vibe to say, create this. So it's using almost like old school ways of creativity, aspiring creativity, or getting yourself in a certain headspace, or like the David Bowie cut and paste kind of thing, or, cut out kind of sense where you're putting lyrics together. So I think it's using conventional models in terms of inspiring creativity, but I don't think the tool itself, the LLM itself, could create something really mind-blowing. It's not like imagine if you go and talk to George Harrison now and just say, how would you approach this song? It can't give you that. That's the thing for me where this disjoin is. You want that level of excitement in terms of somebody playing guitar, for example, one time, or piano, or painting a picture. I think, I wish I could do that. How would you do this? How do you even start doing this? Whether that large language model can then say, well, you need to buy this set of brushes and stuff like this, and in the style of Debussy, he did this. No, do it. Say in terms of saying producing a symphony, for example, he then use this and the orchestra kind of vibe, these instruments here. But even then, you wouldn't get the nuances of it. But you want to be thrilled. I don't think I've seen any instance of using an LLM or an AI in that sense. I started thinking, wow, that's mind blowing. It's always felt like Google Plus. I felt like that's interesting. I've learned about, I don't know, I've learned about some aspect of Git or some weird chord sequence, for example. That's interesting, but I'm not like, it's like when you go to the library and you find that one book that blows your mind. I don't think.
Maybe if you're not quite sure of how to do something. So, you might have an idea about some
Mm,
chords, or it might be about how to, I don't know, technically make some equipment do something. And if you're not sure as a creator, that can be really stifling. But then if you were able to find that out through the use of this automation, then that's surely a good thing for your creative process, because you could possibly do more than you're capable of doing on your own, even though the idea is still pretty much coming
yeah,
from
yeah.
you, which kind of leads me on to the second part of the question, which is that, do you think it's possible to be able to somehow encode your creative decisions into some sort of database and then be able to train an AI to at least give you an approximation of what you would do a creator versus what
Yeah,
I
I
would
think
do
it
or
is.
someone
I mean, it's
else?
just a really simple task, for example, say the way you even say as a creative in your choice of EQ, for example, how you would EQ something and your style in EQing stuff. So with my friend Joy Shannon, I can just basically say, I've worked with her so many times that I know exactly the EQ shape that works best for her voice instantly. With that, I did it through trial and error, but those kind of things with certain people, that knowledge, that little nugget can be used to as a tool to say this is what we're looking at in terms of we have all the people production wise, this is their viewpoint of their EQ. Or when you look at say when the guy's mixing Stones stuff and they got a certain cut on a certain drum sound to actually make it stand out better, etc. So there's a certain dips in the EQ which is going to get you a better mix. And those kind of things, almost like the as an EQ AI, for example, you can say you can analyze the sound and say, well, actually, in context of your vocal sound with the guitar, this is what we think your EQ should be for this. So that would draw from people's experience of EQ.
It depends, doesn't it? Because I think, if you look at sort of early electronic music, well, not early electronic music, early kind of synth pop, let's say, a lot of these bands that were experimenting in the
Mm.
very late 70s, early
Yeah,
80s,
yeah.
Gary Newman, Depeche Mode,
Tangerine
this
Dream
crowd,
in the 70s as well,
they,
Can.
yeah, but like any of these groups that have ever experimented with anything and that have been sort of
Mm.
successfully creative, let's say, in that they've come up with something new or they've come up with a kind of new genre in some cases, it's often not by
No,
following what someone would have in the
exactly.
in the 60s. And it's funny because one of my favorite sort of sounds in all of music actually is this
Mm.
gated reverb
Yeah,
from
yeah.
the 80s on
Yeah, yeah.
snares or in drum sound. Really love the cleanliness of that sound. I think it's really, it's very cool. But I wouldn't necessarily want to
No,
find that in something new.
because it
It would be very weird, listen to like Igloo Ghost or Death Grips
yeah,
or
'cause it
something
doesn't
and
fit.
finding
It
that
doesn't fit.
sound.
And I
I'd be a
think
bit like,
it's
what's
the
this?
adaptive thing of for example, when you look at, say, Kraftwerk, for example, in their Kling Klang studios, when they got in just before we think about the model, and that was like 9-ish, 98, 1979, is that it hit this thing where you had the man machine type aspect, but actually it felt very soulful, even though it was just basically electronic instruments and very just deadpan vocals. It was very human. And I think each one of these things are basically when people experiment with something. Gary Newman, when he recorded that demo, that album in Cambridge, but he just basically this had the synthesizer in the corner and just basically went. He was going to do a punk kind of stuff, and then he pressed the he pressed the key down. I thought, well, what's this? I can make an entire album out of this. And obviously, that's still that kind of thing's still going with his 30th anniversary tours of albums and 40th anniversary stuff as well. But it's just that experimental aspect. So you got the kit. You find sometimes you bump into something, and you hit something and think, "Wow, what's that?" So that's the amazing thing about synthesizers or guitars or finding a certain amp and thinking, "Oh my God, what's this?" And I think that's what AI doesn't have in that sense of that's back to the wow, it blew my socks off. This is I think you want that excitement of hearing something, or say, it's like going to your mate's house and they say, "Listen to this album," and you go, "My God, it's not when I first heard 2112 by Rush, and I'd never heard of them before. I mean, a friend of mine just borrowed a couple of albums off of his big brother without telling him, and he gave me Journey. I think it was a Journey album, the one with the spacecraft coming out. I don't know what the album was. And then this band called Rush and 2112. I thought it's really weird. Anyway, I listened to Journey at the time, and it was just like, yeah, blah blah blah. It's very, it's very AOR type stuff and things. And I put a Rush album on, and it was like, what the hell is this? And then I put on the second side, and I thought, and it had more conventional songs on there. I thought, I really like the production, I like the songwriting, and I put it back on again, just to get the thing of like, did I hear it the first time round? And the thing is, it's those moments of finding a book or finding something, or going for a walk and seeing something, or you think, oh my God, what's that? The best sunset I've ever seen, or what's that plant, or what's this, or you go and you walk around the castle somewhere and you think, my God, look at this, and it puts you into, it starts you thinking about other things. And I think I don't get that from AI. I don't get that from, I find AI is good for coding. I want to throw some code together and quickly. And so instead of me sitting there for hours just tapping away, I can get something up and running from what I've experienced before. That's great for that stuff. That's the grunt work, as I call it at that point. But creativity, I think for me, I've not felt creative with it. And that's not for lack of trying. I think it just hasn't given me that, hearing Van Halen, 1978, thinking, what the hell's that? Eruption. When I heard that in the record store, thinking, what the hell is that?
Yeah. And I think there's an interesting kind of thing with this where you can obviously say if you add randomization algorithms into the way that LLMs work, especially in creative processes, you could say, okay, well, it's doing something here with, sequencing drums. And then above that, you've got your EQ working in this way, and you've got, all of your stuff kind of going. But then it could potentially just do random stabs at anything that could perhaps bring up stuff. So I think that there is some possibility, at least in this. But I think also the next kind of stage with this is got to be not treating it as what's before, but what's possible with what's now. So like in the sense that I think something that hasn't been kind of tapped into in a great way yet, at least in music as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like there isn't a sort of AI aesthetic. There's AI generated stuff, which is attempting to be stuff that's been recorded before, but there isn't its own aesthetic and its own kind of, sort of nuances and sort of strange glitches and all of this kind of thing that could become actually something really interesting. Where do you see the future of music and creativity going?
Now that's a wide-ranging question. I think getting back to your thing of this, AI as it got its own aesthetic, that's one thing with this. But I think if AI is going to survive in music without trying to take over and assimilate it and just get rid of the human element, AI is going to have to be, the AI tool is going to have to be more specific. And from either certain tasks, a grunt work task, that's one thing. Or if into creativity, you're going to have to create something which is like, if you're talking to, for example, as I remember with the Rosebud podcast, which I listened to as well, there's the other guy on there who basically cosplayed Beethoven, for example. So he did the whole show. He actually does a show where he has a show where he basically talks. He lives as Beethoven, under the history and tells everything else. There's conversational Beethoven, etc., and the work, etc., and trying to get some essence of Beethoven the man. So I think for me, as an interesting tool would be if you could actually create something which was Beethoven, for example, and you could have a conversation. You could go off on tangents and stuff, and so not just the music, but actually the life of everything else, as if you were talking to Beethoven. That to me would be inspirational because you've got the historical stuff, but also you've got what Beethoven might have done next. So Beethoven hears Van Halen for the first time. Was
Then don't you think that there's a lot of problems with how kind of coming back to what you were saying before about the biases in data, because then I think that the thing is with historical figures, particularly, especially Beethoven and people of, sort of 17th, 18th, 17th, whatever centuries and back, there's no recordings of them. There's no way of being able to see what they look like, even apart from paintings, which it's an approximation. Of course, there are photographs of some composers like Liszt
Mm.
and Chopin,
No,
but
no.
it's not
And I
enough
think,
to kind of get the person. And then the other side of that as well is any writings about them,
mm,
um, even if they're writings from themselves, of course, it could be in this sense of, trying to spin a tale
yeah,
rather
exactly,
than to
exactly.
tell the
Because
exact truth
think with all
about how
this,
they did or wrote
again,
this.
in an
Yeah.
ideal state, if you get the nuance of Beethoven and put all these things together, that'd be fantastic. It's like going back in time. If you could do that, and then that'd be the ideal sense. I don't think AI can do that because it's just like Jurassic Park. It's like Jurassic Park where they're splicing together DNA to produce a more scary dinosaur, which is not even realistic. So I think where AI is at the minute, it's just approximating the things which seem to be interesting. Ultimately, where it's actually going to, I think, going is that if you can say, I don't know, if you had enough, say, information, say Eddie Van Halen, go back to him again, in terms of his interview points, etc., personal thoughts about things, personal writing, then that might be quite interesting. And so something if you've got a lot of information about a figure or a person or or an expert on certain things, then that might be more useful because obviously you can base things. It's anthropology, isn't it? It's always looking at um, well, over years. I mean, if you look at people now, Homo sapiens, up to a certain point, and obviously now we've got more information about Homo sapiens as a species. We went further and further back, 100,000 years, then we don't know what people think in that point. So it's irrelevant trying to model it back because you can't model history with the biases of today or viewpoints of today. But I think if you're going to produce somebody who's maybe, Brian Eno, you could say, take Brian Eno, for example, dabbling all these things in production and his processes. It might be fascinating to learn something from him as a kind of a masterclass and to maybe have a conversation with that Brian Eno kind of construct up to a certain guardrail in terms of what they could actually acceptably do without too much bias as an inspirational tool. That might be the way forward with this. Is actually it has to be very specific and almost curated in a way. Yeah, it's almost like things like think about Wagner and that thing that Stephen Fry said he shouldn't be cancelled for his music because the music is fantastic, but some of his views weren't obviously fantastic. And whether if you had an AI based around Wagner, you might not. It's almost like never talk to your heroes because you might be disappointed. I think that's the.
But then again, it's an interesting kind of a thing because with Wagner, I think as well because of the association
Yeah.
later with Nazism, I think that there is the potential for his character to be maybe even skewed historically because yes, there are letters and there's obviously I can't remember the name of the Italian
Yeah.
anarchist, the famous Italian anarchist that he was also around as well. But I think there's just so much potential sort of throughout history for any little piece of information to come out that just skews everything.
In some cases, I think historically, we're going down this angle as well. It's almost like you look at it. You don't look at it historically as a personal attack. Again, it's looking at it as almost uh, not an abstract, but basically look at historical figures with some kind of distance because you see it's looking at a sense in perspective where they were. So you can look at someone like Mussolini, or you look at Hitler, or you look at Stalin, etc., or Mao Zedong, or any of these really bad people out there. Is that you can read about it, and I think you do learn in terms of what the bad stuff in the world is about. So historically, it's about understanding things rather than cancelling. If I said to say going to cancel Wagner because he had certain views, and say we're going to get rid of his music. I think that would be, I think Stephen Fry argued that as well. Is that would be nonsensical because you can't. He's a great artist and says what he produced, and historically, it fits a certain niche, etc. But I think we have to have some kind of level of um, look at it clarity, also the level of headedness in terms of we have to be objective about it as well. So I think because we know the context, I think that's the thing. Is that there's a certain point if you were trying to produce, say, Wagner as a kind of an AI, there may be things you disagree with totally, but that disagreement also might be inspirational in saying that I don't want to do that, I want to do this, And so it's the way, I know Bach ended a piece, etc., or Beethoven did something, or Debussy Debussy was lambasted for his work and saying, well, what's he doing here? Some of these pieces early pieces didn't make any sense. And then later ones, the hits, should we say, were a certain thing. Or Stravinsky, and thinking, well, there must have been lots of points when Stravinsky was putting the piece together was actually rubbish. Or Mozart, maybe, I don't know whether there are any bad pieces, I'm not even sure, but maybe Mozart had other things flying, and so everything was great.
Well,
Yeah, exactly.
Depends on your view, I guess, but
Almost having something on demand as an AI, I think sometimes it can be very intrusive because you're not then you're waiting for it was like something you're not trusting to your own self intuition at that point. You actually think, well, it's like scrolling on something and say, well, give me an idea, give me an idea, give me an idea, and then your brain switches off. I think there's that thing. I think with these devices, with LLMs, etc., there is a higher dependency on. I think in some respects, and so if you're using them intermittently, that's one thing. But if you're dependent on it, then you aren't going to be creative because then your creativity is being shadowed by this tool, and that's where it goes horribly wrong in that respect. So I don't think it's not saying this using these tools be a doom thing where it just killed everything off. I think it's things in the right place. So with distortion pedal, you won't put kind of a kind of a tube screen over everything. You basically kind of a color. So it's almost like having a setup where you had things which you could occasionally chip in, maybe, but as a human being would chip in. It's like if you're if you're working on something and then the machine says, we thought about plugging that in that. It's observing how you're doing some stuff and I think what you need to do is you plug this into this, and then if you try something else and that's interesting, you say, have we tried to turn that knob up here or plugging something else in, as you would do with hardware stuff. I think what you're asking for is obviously sentience in that respect, and that's not going to happen. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. Also, you want somebody who is on your side as a mentor, but also as a peer in that respect. So that's where it falls down for me. I think it's what I see at the minute is just grunt work, doing the heavy stuff, your heavy lifting you don't want to do to get speed up the process. So recording, you don't want to sit through Pro Tools or Logic going, how do I record this before you start? You want to basically press record it and play something, and that captures it. So the AI could actually get the levels right, engineer it properly, etc. In terms of you want to engineer it, say I want to engineer it into Jimi Hendrix kind of 1968 kind of vibe in a specific studio and get that. That'd be the dream thing for that kind of thing. Then this basically can come through that. But I think as a co-creator, you would have to be done almost as a kind of in a masterclass setting where it's conversational for a bit, then you went off and did your own thing. I think that's, to me, that would be where it's at.